Hey friends, you're tuned in to the Learn or Be Learned podcast, a show where wisdom meets curiosity in order to discover the human experience. I'm your host, Shiva D, and remember, you either learn from or you're learned from. Now, let's get back to the show. All right, welcome back, friends, to another great episode here on Learn or Be Learned. This is a very interesting episode, to say the least. I haven't done in a university affiliated episode, I think, in 2 years since Emory. But yeah, I remember interviewing people on the Autism Awareness Organization and some professors and PhD students and teachers and students and whatnot. But here we are. This is actually a little bit different. I have a final exam project due in my consciousness class. And for those of you that may know or may not know, I'm getting a master's in Ayurveda and integrative medicine. I love medicine, but I didn't fully believe that the path I was going down in the medical field was giving me the information I was seeking, right? I wanted to know how to live a healthier, more balanced life. And that's a whole nother topic for another day. But here I am. I found this master's program. I love it. And I have a few points I'd love to talk about on this episode that is also for my class, but I thought I'd, shoot two birds with one stone here and share with you guys too, which I think would be really cool. So this episode, we're going to kind of touch on the idea of consciousness, this fourth state of consciousness that Dr. John Hagelin has talked about, and slightly touch on this thing called the unified field theory, which I'm sort of starting to grasp, but I don't want to jump too much into it because I don't really understand it fully yet. But it's for my class, so I do need to touch on it. But let's start with the consciousness, right? So, what exactly is consciousness? To be exact, it's always being debated what it truly is, where it truly stems from. But in a sense, it's the conscious, or I guess awareness of one's inner and outer reality based on our perceived senses. Which is why it's interesting, because if our perceived senses can be altered, then theoretically consciousness could be altered. Then is consciousness really what we believe it is, or is it more, right? Is there more to consciousness than what we understand? And we'll get into that a little bit. But yeah, I think consciousness is very interesting. You also can see things, when I studied anthropology, there was this thing called the theory of mind, which is basically our God-given mental faculties to understand the awareness of not just ourselves, but the perception of others, right? We can understand that someone else might be sad, or why they might be sad, or our ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. At least the capacity. I know not everybody in today's day and age does that, but we do have the capacity for it. And which is interesting though, because if you're on the autistic spectrum, you actually aren't equipped with all these mental faculties, which is why you see them with diminished understandings of social complexities, or depending on the spectrum, but usually there is some level of, or to some degree, a diminished ability to understand social complexities. And then you have an interesting one, is the ability to grasp this idea of religion. Can they understand it? Yes, but do they understand it from the perspective of belief and faith? No, right? Which is, I think, is really interesting, because that requires a theory of mind in order to have a belief in a religion. And then another interesting point I'd have to say is empathy, right? Their ability to empathize. Obviously, it's a spectrum, so there's a degree to this, but the ability to empathize is a mental faculty given to us in a natural state when one does have a theory of mind, which I think can also correlate to consciousness. But obviously it's not exclusive, because you can have consciousness and be autistic, right? So I mean, not to jump in this rabbit hole, but consciousness, I don't believe at least, is mutually exclusive to humans. I think there is consciousness in other beings. Maybe they don't have the exact same mental faculties as us, the same tool sets to maneuver through life. Maybe we were given something more. But consciousness in itself is awareness, right? Is life. I mean, look at all these today's modern slang we say mother nature, we say um, all these things which kind of hint towards this idea of consciousness existing beyond us, right? But to jump in a little bit, I think, today too many people are so stuck on theoretical knowledge that we've forgotten that experiential understanding is just as important, especially as someone who went through at least half of the medical field journey. I saw a lot of pressure to understand theoretical knowledge, but to me, I think life is the culmination of both. You have to have, think about it, right? You could study business all day. You could read books, you can listen to people, but if you don't have that experiential understanding, you never did it, you don't truly understand what it's like to know business. Right? Same thing here with consciousness, with spirituality, with I believe, you know, this quantum physics, quantum mechanics, science, even just science. I believe we are so far into this theoretical knowledge where it's called reductionism, and you see it, which was really cool because I studied anthropology and theology, but also medicine at the same time. So it was really cool to see this dichotomy where half of my classes were on this experiential understanding, and then the other side was hammering you with theoretical knowledge. And they said, if there's no evidence, it doesn't exist. It's, you get hammered that way, and you start to believe it to the point where you don't actually have faith in anything that's not above theoretical knowledge, which is interesting because science is always ever changing. But to go back to it, we actually did talk about that in this course a little bit, the idea of theoretical knowledge and experiential understanding. And I do believe to truly understand consciousness is not just to read about it or understand it at a theoretical level, a reading level, but also experience it through your awareness, right? Just daily life, meditation, calmness, reflection. I think too many of us try to numb out the experiential understanding portion because either it's scary, there's fear attached, there's things we don't want to look at about ourselves, about others, our situation maybe. So we avoid it. We run away from the other part of life, which is not which is getting the opportunity to live it. So I think that's really important. But to jump right into this next idea of consciousness, so Dr. Hagelin talks about how there is more than three states of consciousness, right? You have waking, sleeping, and dreaming. But he suggests that there is actually a fourth state where I believe he coined the term transcendent consciousness, which essentially is our ability to, right. So when he was explaining this, he showed this graph of two brains. One brain had just a normal brain, and small parts of the brain communicated with each other, but not very much. And then the other side, every portion of the brain was interconnected. And he called this side the transcendence side. And apparently what the differentiator was meditation. The other person had meditated for 3 months, and this was the study that was done. So it was really interesting to see how, you know, because of this transcendent state, when they started taking tests and measures, every area of intelligence improved, from practical intelligence to fluid intelligence to emotional regulation, amongst the numerous health benefits from, lowered stress, lowered risk of health ailments like heart attack to diabetes to stroke. I mean, this is free, guys. This is just, you got to spend time and have faith and belief. You actually do start to notice a difference in, at least when I began doing it, I noticed a difference in my emotional regulation, emotional state, my calmness, my ability to handle pressure and stress had improved. Yeah, I believe there is some merit for this And even the one of our guest speakers, Dr. Keith Wallace, showed a bunch of research showing how meditation reduced all these health effects as well. So, I do believe meditation is incredible. It's very profound on what it does, and we're still trying to understand it. And I do believe there is a linkage to consciousness with it, right? So if we're jumping into this third point, we have this concept called the unified field theory. I'm going to try my best. I am. Okay. So we have four known forces, fundamental forces in physics and in science, chemistry as well. And I believe it's the weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, strong nuclear force, and then gravity. Right, so the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force, I've often seen it in this idea of chemistry when you have atoms and molecules, and this is kind of how atoms and molecules kind of have that attraction for each other and the way they interact. And you know, that's a whole semester of knowledge there, but essentially that's the glue that keeps the atoms and molecules forming together, which eventually form more and more, and then that's how you have the table you're sitting at, right? How a table is solid, how a table is a table is the intermolecular forces. But then we have electromagnetism, which just basically says that, you know, these interactions emit, this electricity, this electromagnetic state. And then we have gravity, right? And everybody to some extent understands gravitational pull of a mass. The heavier the object, the more the gravitational pull. But what scientists couldn't understand was the first three made sense, right? Electromagnetism, strong, weak, nuclear force, they all kind of go together. They're all like attraction states. But then gravity kind of felt different because it was like, okay, gravity pulls things down to the highest mass, but it's not really an attraction state, right? To them, it was just mind boggling of how this would relate to the other three. So they kept trying to figure out like how this would occur. And eventually they are looking at this idea called the unified field theory, which is essentially saying there is one whole fundamental force that stems towards these other forces, right? There's a unified force. And not to get too much into what this idea really means, but when Dr. Haglin was explaining it, basically, if you look at the ocean and the waves and everything, these are the fundamental forces that you see interacting. But if you go in the depths of the ocean where it's silent and not moving, that's the unified field theory. That's the unified force, the unified field theory where consciousness can even occur, right? So, and when he was explaining this, he was saying like it's not dead, it's not moving, it's almost like reverberating in itself. It's just kind of like flowing with potential, and then you know things occur from that point of start. And who knows if this is true or not, but smarter men than me are looking into it. But from what I can understand, something that I thought was interesting is Nikola Tesla's work. And he talks about if you want to understand the universe, think of in terms of waves, vibrations, and frequencies. And that's so interesting because if you think, because Dr. Haglin's talking about how this is a reverberating state, right? Where this is just vibration. So from that vibration creates the potential vibration, creates vibrating states of existence. And then from there, blah, 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 we grow, and here we are today. This is like, I know this is a very different episode. It's pretty deep. It's maybe even a little confusing, but it goes to show that, perhaps there's more to this life than we kind of truly understand. If you had to get an essence of what I was talking about in this episode, there is more to life than what we understand. Even when I remember a few years ago, I mean, I go to India quite a bit, but a few years ago I was in India and I was going on my daily walk in the morning, and I noticed these design patterns they'd put at the front of the house. We call it columns in Tamil Nadu, but essentially I just didn't understand why. And when I would ask people, they didn't really know why either. They would just say it's tradition. And Indian tradition is very, very old, to the point where I think there is a lot of lost knowledge where we just do rituals to do them and we don't really truly understand anymore. But I'm always curious, I'm always asking questions. And a few years later, on social media, I see this guy he puts sand on this vibrational plate, and then he hits different frequencies, different hertz on it, and depending on the hurt, it creates a different pattern. And then I looked at it, I was like, that looks like those columns that I saw, right? The design patterns that they created outside the houses in India, only to make me think maybe, this is a possibility, that back then they would create these design patterns as a way of emitting a vibrational state of being outside the house, right? Like a positivity thing, like to just kind of, every time you enter the home, you enter with positivity. And I think that's honestly a pretty cool idea. Maybe that's where it stems from. And, from the anthropology side, there is definitely lost knowledge. If you look at the temples in India, if you look at the pyramids of Egypt, there's so many unanswered questions of how a structure to that magnitude could be built way, way before the level of technology we have now. And even today, we couldn't do it to that level they did, which has to mean there's a gap in our human history and lost technology. I don't know. I think that's just profound to me. But, if you want to enter this creative state, this flow state, perhaps this is slightly like us tapping into this unified field of our mind, is just because when I started doing transcendental meditation, the way they explain it is you go deeper, deeper into your mind, kind of like an ocean, to the point where you're at this, like, the bottom of the ocean, where it's like quiet and not moving. And that's how you calm your mind, right? I know many of us could probably relate to this idea of an overactive mind, but the meditation kind of grounds you and gets you lower. That, I believe, in to some way, that is like the unified field, which I know in another episode I talked about how the microcosm and macrocosm almost have a reflection of each other, meaning the little things have a resemblance of bigger things, right? How carrots, if you cut a carrot, it looks like an iris, and carrots have carotene, which is good for your eyes. Walnut is composed of 70% fat, looks like a brain. Your brain's composed of 70% fat, I believe. And walnuts are really good for your brain. I mean, there is a lot of resemblances, and perhaps that's just another one, but I did Google it. It's around 60+% fat, which is kind of crazy, these resemblances. But, without getting too much more into it, I know this was a very in-depth and very heavy episode compared to the usual content. And, you know, I think the more I take this course and the more I understand this master's program, the better I will get at understanding it, which will make it easier for me to explain it to you guys. But hopefully, you guys got a couple cool points out of this. Maybe you'll have to rewatch it. Maybe you'll have to go slower to understand it. Or maybe I was just confusing at some points. But I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, everybody, you either learn from or you're learned from. Thanks. Bye.